Malcolm Gladwell is one of the most influential public intellectuals of our time. His books, The Tipping Point, Outliers, Blink, have shaped how millions of people think about psychology, culture, and society. So when Gladwell recently admitted that he was cowed and ashamed of publicly supporting a position on gender that he privately believed was wrong, caught my attention. Not because it was surprising, but because it perfectly illustrates what I call bioclasm in my book, Fake ID: the cultural pressure to subordinate biological reality to ideological demands. Now, what's remarkable is that years earlier, Gladwell had already let it slip what he really believed. He just didn't seem to notice he'd said it out loud. So, this is a story about how even brilliant people can be pressured into denying what they know to be true and what that tells us about the Orwellian nature of gender ideology. So, let me back you up to 2022. Gladwell's podcast, Revisionist History, aired an episode called The Magic Wand Experiment. The premise was simple. Researchers from various fields were invited to imagine that they could wave a magic wand that removed all barriers, financial, physical, even ethical, to conduct any experiment they wanted. It was a playful idea. Now, one of the researchers was Dr. Joyce Benenson of Harvard. She's a Harvard psychologist who specializes in human sex differences. Benenson's imagined experiment, when she waved the magic wand, was provocative. She would remove the penises from infant boys at birth and attach them to random infant girls without the parents' knowledge. The parents would then unknowingly raise boys as girls and girls as boys. So what would happen, they wondered? Well, here's where it gets interesting. Gladwell explained that this fake experiment would settle the question of whether socialization or biology determines gendered behavior. And Benenson, according to Gladwell, was, quote, pretty sure what the answer is, end quote. As Gladwell put it, she thinks that if you take boys and raise them as girls, nothing's going to change. Remove the penises, dress them in pink, none of that will alter their behavior. In other words, biology overrides socialization. The boys would still act like boys, the girls would still act like girls. Parenting doesn't override biology. But here's the line that made me do a double take. When describing what would happen to the children, Benenson referred to them being raised as, quote, the opposite sex from what they were biologically destined. Biologically destined, not assigned at birth, as gender ideology insists on saying. Destined, as in fixed, determined, real. Gladwell wrapped up the segment with a wry comment. Have I shocked your delicate sensibilities yet? I wonder if he realized whose sensibilities should have been shocked. That same year, 2022, Gladwell moderated a panel at the MIT Sloan Sports Analytics Conference. The topic was the path forward for the inclusion of transgendered athletes in women's sports. On the panel was sports scientist Ross Tucker, who argued against allowing biological males to compete in female categories. At the time, Gladwell presented himself as objective, asking questions, letting the panelists speak. But something was off. Tucker later recounted that his comments were met with deathly silence, while pro-trans panelists received cheers from the audience. Now fast forward from 2022 to September 2025. Gladwell appeared on Tucker's podcast, The Real Science of Sport, and made a stunning admission.
The reason I'm ashamed of my performance at that panel because I share your position 100%, and I was cowed.
Let that sink in. One of the most prominent journalists in the world admitted that he publicly supported a position he privately believed was wrong because he was afraid to say otherwise. The idea of saying anything on this issue, Gladwell continued.
I believe in retrospect, in a dishonest way, I was objective in a dishonest way. I let a lot of howlers pass.
Gladwell recalled a moment during the panel when a transgender athlete said that if trans women are allowed to compete in women's sports, quote, we have to let them win. Not win disproportionately, just win, at least sometimes. It was at that moment, Gladwell said,
this argument has gone to the furthest extreme. What the trans movement is not asking for, they're not asking for, a place at the table. They're not asking to be treated with respect and dignity. What they're asking is for no one to question the considerable physiological advantage they bring to the sport.
What Gladwell describes is exactly what I call bioclasm in Fake ID. Bioclasm is the cultural movement that subordinates biological reality to subjective feelings about identity. But it doesn't just make claims, it enforces them. It creates an environment where people who know something is true are afraid to say it. Notice what happened. In the Magic Wand episode, Gladwell and Benenson freely discuss the reality that biological sex determines behavior, that boys raised as girls will still act like boys. Biologically destined, Benenson said. And Gladwell didn't push back. Why? Because in that context, it didn't feel like a politically charged statement. It was just science. But when the same biological reality was applied to sports in the very same year, where the implications were obvious and the ideological enforcers were paying attention, Gladwell went silent. He knew the truth, but wouldn't say it. This is Orwellian in the truest sense. In 1984, the goal of the party wasn't just to control behavior, but to control thought, to make people affirm what they knew to be false. 2 + 2 = 5. Gladwell didn't believe that biological males should compete in female sports, but he performed as if he did believe it, and performance, repeated often enough, becomes its own kind of reality collapse. Here's what I find hopeful in all of this. The truth has a way of slipping out. In the Magic Wand episode, Gladwell couldn't help but let biological reality into the conversation, even though it contradicts the ideological framework he was apparently too afraid to challenge elsewhere that very same year. Reality's gravitational pull is relentless. You can deny it in one context, but it reasserts itself in another. And Gladwell's recent confession shows that the pressure can't hold forever. He called the period around 2020 to 2022 a time of profound cultural destabilization. He said, "I think we all went crazy." And he now believes that if the same panel were held today, there would be, quote, near unanimity in the room that trans athletes have no place in the female category, end quote. The cultural winds are shifting, but we should pause and ask, how many other people, researchers, journalists, doctors, teachers, parents, how many of them have been cowed into silence? How many have publicly affirmed what they privately know to be false? And more importantly, what does it do to a society when telling the truth requires courage and lying is the path of least resistance? Malcolm Gladwell is, by his own admission, ashamed of his silence. I'm glad he's speaking up now, but this episode should trouble all of us. Not because Gladwell is uniquely weak, but because the pressure he describes is everywhere. Bioclasm doesn't just make arguments. It makes examples of its dissenters. It cows people into compliance, and when even someone with Gladwell's platform and his resources feels unable to speak, imagine what ordinary people face. In Fake ID, I argue that we need compassionate truth-telling, the courage to say what's real without demonizing those who disagree. And Gladwell's story shows why that's so hard, but it also shows why it's so necessary. Because when we let fear silence truth, reality doesn't change, but our perception of it collapses, one silent compromise at a time.